A 1994 U.S. State Department report on the global landmine crisis contains a single buried statistic that most readers would skim straight past. In late 1944, in the Lorraine region of eastern France, a patrol from the 357th Infantry Regiment found 12,000 mines in one field. Not 12,000 across a campaign, 12,000 in a single position, made mostly of plastic and wood, carrying almost no metal at all, essentially invisible to the standard American detector every engineer in that unit was carrying. The engineers cleared it anyway. The regiment moved on. That second sentence, they moved on, is really the whole story this piece is about, because Germany, by any honest technical measure, built the finest landmines on Earth by 1944, and it didn't matter nearly as much as it should have. Mine production was one of the very few areas where the Reich was still genuinely outproducing its enemies that late in the war. By the time of the Normandy invasion, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had buried somewhere between 5 and 6 million mines along the Atlantic coast alone. German industry turned up more than 3.5 million Teller anti-tank mines of the 1943 pattern by itself, close to 2 million S-mines, 3 million wooden Regal bar mines, and something on the order of 11 million all-glass anti-personnel mines before the war ended. On paper, that arithmetic should have stopped the American advance cold, somewhere on the beach or in the dunes behind it. It didn't. By the time American engineers reached the Rhine, they were clearing German minefields with something close to the same procedure that patrol in Lorraine had used months earlier. Find them, mark them, dispose of them, keep moving. British Lieutenant Colonel C.E. Sloan, in his post-war study Mine Warfare on Land, called the S-mine probably the single most feared device Allied troops encountered in the entire war. Those fields sat in front of the invasion beaches, and the American army walked through them, not over them, not around them, through them, losing feet and legs and lives the entire way. By 1945, U.S. Army records in the European theater credited mines with roughly 2.5% of all combat fatalities and just over 20% of all tank losses. Those are genuinely staggering numbers for a single weapons category. To understand how the advance kept its footing anyway, you have to go back nearly 2 years before D-Day to a North African desert in October 1942, where the actual answer to Rommel's mines was first tested in the hands of a Polish lieutenant almost no American has ever heard of. Why the mines ultimately failed only makes sense once you see why Germany was so confident they wouldn't. By the autumn of 1943, the wider strategic picture had already turned decisively against the Reich. Stalingrad, Kursk, Tunisia lost, Sicily lost, the Italian government itself collapsing. The army that had rolled across Poland and France in weeks was now, unmistakably, the army about to be invaded. That November, Hitler handed Rommel, the Desert Fox, freshly humbled in Africa, a new assignment: command of the anti-invasion forces along the Channel coast, with one simple mandate: stop the Allies on the beaches. Rommel had learned hard lessons in Africa, and one of the hardest was about mines. When he personally inspected the Atlantic Wall that December, what he found wasn't encouraging. Incomplete fortifications, troop strength stretched thin, reserves badly positioned. He couldn't fix most of that quickly, but mine density was one lever he could pull at genuinely industrial scale, and he pulled it hard. According to the post-war interrogation of his own naval advisor, Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, the monthly mine supply reaching Rommel's sector when he arrived ran around 40,000 units. He accelerated and multiplied that dramatically, and by June 1944, more than triple, the pre-war stockpile had been laid in his sector alone, bringing the total in front of the invasion beaches to somewhere between 5 and 6 million devices by the morning of the landings. Anti-tank, anti-personnel, anti-glider, seemingly anti-everything. These weren't crude improvisations. The Teller mine, in its 1935, 1942, and 1943 revisions, was a steel-cased disc roughly a foot across. packed with about 12 pounds of TNT and fitted with a pressure plate requiring somewhere near 200 pounds of force to trigger. Anything heavier than a man walking set it off, and the resulting blast could strip the tracks off any tank fielded during the entire war. Every teller carried 2 additional fuse wells built specifically for anti-handling devices. Try lifting one without disarming the secondary fuse first, and you lost your hands and very possibly your face in the same instant. The S-mine, the shrapnel mine, nicknamed the Bouncing Betty by American troops, was the anti-personnel weapon Allied infantry had genuinely dreaded above almost anything else. A steel cylinder roughly 5 inches tall, packed with somewhere around 360 steel balls or short rods sitting above a small propellant charge, triggered by pressure or a tripwire, that fired the entire inner body roughly waist-high into the air before the main charge detonated a few seconds later. American training manuals listed it as reliably lethal out to about 66 feet, with serious casualties possible well past 400. The Wehrmacht laid these in deliberate patterns built directly around anti-tank mines, so that men rushing to help a disabled tank crew became the actual intended targets. Then there was the Schützenmine 42, the Schuhmine, S-mine's quieter, smaller cousin, a wooden box roughly 4 by 5 by 2.5 inches, a hinged lid, and about 200 grams of cast TNT inside, with the only metal anywhere in the entire device being a tiny fragment inside the detonator itself, small enough that a standard American mine detector could barely register it at all. A British engineer who fought through the Scheldt Estuary campaign later described the actual work of finding these things as a continuous stream of horrific casualties, with no reliable method beyond slow, close-range probing under fire, some men paying for the particular search with their lives. Add to that catalog the Regal bar mine, built from compressed wood pulp, cardboard and tar, and the Glasmine 43, with its all-glass body and chemical fuse. By late 1944, the German inventory read almost like a museum of deliberate anti-detection engineering, with something on the order of 11 million Glasmine 43s alone produced before the war's end. None of this was improvised at the point of use, either. German pioneer, or combat engineer, battalions trained from their first weeks in the actual geometry of minefield placement, keeping formal records for every device, every fuse, every booby trap, and a documented mine plan, with a broader minefield map showing all obstacles in a given sector and their tactical significance, genuine fields marked with vertical lettering on red and white boards, dummy fields marked with slanted lettering, a distinction meant to be legible only to German engineers themselves, in case captured infantrymen ever revealed which fields were real under interrogation. This was the system Rommel was personally trusting on the morning of June 6, 1944. Millions of carefully recorded, properly fused, expertly laid explosive devices sitting in front of his beaches, behind his beaches, and along every road leading inland from them. The American answer to that arithmetic had, in fact, already been quietly developing for 2.5 years, in places nobody was paying much attention to at the time, and the first piece of it had nothing to do with America at all. It begins in Scotland, and it begins with a tragedy nobody planned to build a weapon system out of. Józef Kasaki was a Polish signals officer, an electrical engineer by training, who had escaped to Britain after the 1939 invasion of his own country and continued serving in the Polish army in exile. In June 1941, a Polish patrol from the 10th Armored Cavalry Brigade was sent to sweep a stretch of Scottish beach near Arbroath that had been mined by the British themselves against a feared German invasion, mines whose locations had been so poorly recorded that the patrol walked straight into their own side's defenses. None of the men returned. The disaster shook both British and Polish command badly enough that a formal competition opened almost immediately for a genuinely reliable, man-portable mine detector, something better than a bayonet and a soldier's nerve. 7 separate designs were submitted, Kasaki's won outright, built around a simple induction balance principle. A coil at the end of a roughly 6-foot bamboo pole, a small amplifier carried in a rucksack, dry cell batteries, and a set of headphones that changed pitch the instant the coil passed near buried metal. He refused to patent the design at all, handing it to the British Army as an outright gift, and accepted nothing more than a personal letter of thanks from the king in return. At the Second Battle of El Alamein that October, 500 of Kasaki's detectors were rushed to the Eighth Army, doubling the speed at which engineers could clear the German-laid belts Rommel's own men had nicknamed the Devil's Gardens, from roughly 100 meters an hour up to around 200. Those belts weren't a minor obstacle. Rommel had ordered them laid in depths running to several miles in places, an estimated 500,000 mines or more woven together with barbed wire and dummy positions, specifically to force any British attack into narrow, heavily covered lanes where his own artillery had already been pre-registered. British sappers, before Kasaki's device arrived, had been clearing them essentially by hand, a pair of men crawling forward with a single bayonet between them, a method Field Marshal Montgomery's own staff considered dangerously slow for the scale of breakthrough the battle actually required. That doesn't sound like a revolutionary number in isolation. Under artillery fire, in the dark, with an entire assault waiting on the far side of a minefield, it was frequently the exact difference between an attack that succeeded and one that simply died on its own start line. I think it's worth pausing on the fact that Kasaki's own name was deliberately kept out of most wartime and even post-war accounts of his own invention, published instead under pseudonyms like Joseph Koss or Kasaki, specifically to protect his family, who remained trapped in German-occupied Poland for the rest of the war. He returned home himself after 1945, and rather than cash in on an invention that had already saved countless Allied lives, spent the remainder of his career teaching electronics at Warsaw's Institute for Nuclear Research, largely uncredited in his own country for the thing he was actually best known for everywhere else. He got a fuller version of that credit only decades later, well after his death in 1990. The design he'd handed over for nothing in 1941 continued in frontline military service, in steadily modified form into the 1990s, used again in the deserts of the Gulf War, nearly 50 years after Kasaki first built it from spare parts to answer a Scottish beach he never should have had to answer for. American observers were watching closely. By September 1942, the U.S. Army Signal Corps had standardized its own version for mass production, designated the SCR-625, built around the identical underlying principle: coil, amplifier, headphones, a wooden carrying case, but manufactured in American factories at genuinely American industrial scale. The first SCR-625 sets reached troops during the Operation Torch landings in Morocco that November. The unit weighed roughly 7.5 pounds, fully loaded with batteries, and could detect metallic mines buried 6 to 12 inches down, short of the 18 inches the Army had originally hoped for, but more than adequate against most German mines, which were rarely buried deeper than a single foot. The detector alone was never really the breakthrough, though. The actual breakthrough was everything the U.S. Army wrapped around it. For most of the interwar period, American engineer doctrine had sat as a quiet, largely unglamorous corner of the service, and Field Manual 21-105, the Engineer Soldier's Handbook, published June 2, 1943, contains no famous quotes and no rousing speeches, just a single sentence near its opening that defines the entire mission with almost bureaucratic bluntness: that the engineer's job was to make sure friendly troops moved forward against all opposition, and to make sure enemy obstacles never interfered with that advance. By mid-1943, the Army had begun building the actual organization to carry that sentence out at scale. Combat engineer battalions attached directly at division level, their men trained as infantry first and engineers second, each battalion typically built around 3 lettered companies plus headquarters and service support, carrying demolition and satchel charges, Bangalore torpedoes, mine detectors, bridging gear, axes, bulldozers, and rifles. Over the course of the war, the U.S. Army would eventually field something on the order of the 700 separate combat engineer battalions. 700. The entire German army, across every front, never came close to fielding a comparable fraction of that combat engineer's strength. This is the part of the answer that photographs badly. There's no famous wartime picture of an engineer soldier's handbook, but it's the single link in the causal chain that actually matters most. Germany built the finest individual mines in the world. America built the largest dedicated engineer force in the world specifically to clear them. It's worth being fair to the German side of this equation before moving past it, because the Wehrmacht's own combat engineers were, by any honest measure, excellent at their specific job. German pioneer battalions operated under a genuinely sophisticated counter-mobility doctrine, treating minefields not as scattered obstacles, but as an integrated defensive system, laid in depth, tied directly into pre-registered artillery and covered by observation wherever possible, with detailed records kept specifically so friendly forces could later pass through their own fields safely. The problem Germany never solved wasn't tactical competence at laying mines, it was strategic depth in clearing anyone else's. Germany fielded serious combat engineer formations, but nothing approaching the American scale of roughly 700 dedicated battalions, because German industrial and manpower priorities by 1943 were already stretched thin enough that a specialized branch built purely around defeating obstacles rather than building or exploiting them, never received comparable resources. That asymmetry, one army built to lay mines expertly, the other built at industrial scale specifically to clear them, is close to the entire story in miniature. After the initial landings at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, the American advance pushed east and collided directly with Axis forces in the Tunisian mountains, and the campaign that followed between November 1942 and May 1943 was the U.S. Army's first sustained encounter with genuine German mine warfare. The lessons were brutal. At Kasserine Pass that February, American formations were broken outright by Rommel's own veterans, a defeat this channel has covered in detail elsewhere, so I'll only note the specific piece relevant here. American inexperience with German counter-mobility doctrine, the systematic use of minefields and demolitions to channel and bleed an advancing force, compounded that particular disaster badly, costing hundreds of American tanks and hundreds of American lives to mines alone that single month. What happened after Kasserine, though, is something the German army never managed in reverse across the rest of the war. The Americans learned from it fast and methodically. By the time American engineers reached Sicily that July, Doctrine had already tightened considerably. Engineer companies attached directly to regimental landing teams, moving with the lead infantry rather than behind it. By the time Fifth Army landed at Salerno that September, mine-clearing teams were actually working ahead of the riflemen, sweeping the beach with SCR 625 detectors, even while machine gun fire from German positions was still raking the surf around them. The advance up the Italian peninsula that followed ground forward through mud and rain against what one British general called, without much exaggeration, an engineer's war. Every road demolished, every bridge dropped, every approach mined. Eighth Army's commander, Sir Harold Alexander, summed up the entire campaign in a single line that survived in numerous British histories since, that all roads led to Rome and all roads were mined. By the time the U.S. Army reached Normandy in June 1944, 2.5 years of hard-won practice had been baked directly into standard doctrine. Combat engineer companies trained routinely alongside infantry. Mine detectors were issued by the thousand. The M1A1 Bangalore torpedo, 10 5-foot pipe sections, each packed with roughly 9 pounds of TNT connected end to end and pushed forward by a single soldier or a small team, had become standard issue down to assault platoon level, capable of blasting a yard-wide path through wire or surface mines in seconds. Men like technician J. Rencher of the 531st Amphibious Engineer Battalion didn't simply happen to arrive on Utah Beach that morning. They arrived because for 18 months before D-Day even began, the U.S. Army had been quietly and methodically building what remains, by most honest historical assessments, the single most heavily resourced mine-clearing force in the entire history of land warfare. The 531st landed at Terre Green Beach in the Utah sector near Sainte-Mère-Église at the very head of the assault wave that morning. Rencher's own mission, by his later account to historians, was specific and genuinely terrible. Cut a 2-inch steel cable strung underwater to block landing craft, destroy the rows of beach obstacles, lay a road of perforated steel matting across the sand, and clear a path through the minefield, sitting directly behind the seawall. Before the landing, his squad had been told plainly that within 2 hours, most of them would probably be dead. A friend of his, a young man the unit called Ham, had been oddly certain throughout training that he personally would survive. Ham took a mine blast on the beach that morning. Both legs were amputated below the knee at a forward aid station, and according to Rencher's own recollection, when Ham woke up on the hospital ship and was told what had happened, he asked what a baseball player was even supposed to do without legs, turned to face the wall, and died there. 2 or 3 men on Rencher's own 3-man team didn't survive that day. The minefield they had been sent to clear was cleared anyway. That single fact is, in its simplest possible form, the entire answer to why Rommel's plan ultimately failed. Not that the mines didn't work as designed at the level of 1 man, 1 tank, 1 stretch of road, but that the minefield as a system was a passive weapon facing an active enemy who had organized itself entirely around the specific problem of getting through it regardless of cost. By June 7th, the 4th Infantry Division had already pushed inland from the beach, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. famously walking across the sand with nothing more than a cane and a pistol. By June 12th, American engineers had cleared roughly 15,000 S-mines from the area around Utah Beach and the town of Poopaville alone. 15,000 of the exact steel cylinders Lieutenant Colonel Sloan had called the single most feared device of the entire war. And by the end of that month, hundreds of thousands more had come out of the bocage roads behind the beach. The mines did exactly what they were engineered to do at the individual level. They killed and maimed real Americans, one at a time, all across Normandy. They did not stop the advance itself, because the system built to answer them had never actually depended on any single mine failing to work. Curtis Cullen's hedgerow-cutting device, welded from scrap German beach obstacles and demonstrated for Omar Bradley that July, belongs to the same broader story of American improvisation under pressure, though this channel has already told his fuller story elsewhere, so I'll leave it there rather than retell it in full. The Germans noticed exactly what the Americans were building in Normandy. They didn't stop trying to counter it. By autumn 1944, with their armies falling back toward the west wall along the Saar, a new generation of mines was already going into the ground, specifically engineered to defeat the SCR-625 outright. Wood, glass, bakelite, compressed cardboard, tar, anything that kept metal content as close to zero as manufacturing would allow. The Glasmine 43 had entered serial production in early 1944, and by the time American forces reached the German frontier that autumn, some 11 million had been ordered built. Its body was a glass bowl roughly 6 inches across, sealed with a thick molded glass pressure plate and a thinner glass disc beneath. Step on it, and the lower disc shattered and triggered the detonator, firing roughly 200 grams of TNT. Early fuses still carried trace metal. Later versions used a purely chemical igniter that eliminated even that faint signature entirely, rendering the mine essentially deaf to both the SCR-625 and Kasaki's own original detector design. Glass fragments embedded in wounded men were also notoriously difficult to spot on period X-ray equipment, which meant infections from retained fragments became a genuinely common and dangerous complication of these specific wounds. The Regal anti-tank mine used the same underlying logic in a heavier form. Its case compressed wood pulp, cardboard, and tar. Its plugs glass, with only a small metal fragment in the detonator itself, deliberately left in so German engineers could still locate their own devices later. Those mines were coated with a sandy compound called Tarn salts that German detector crews could pick up. When Allied investigators finally got around to analyzing captured samples of it after the war, they discovered it was mildly radioactive and that the actual German detector built to find it had simply been a Geiger counter, a genuinely clever countermeasure that stayed secret until the war's final weeks. And the shoe mine, already in mass production since mid-1942, kept going into the ground in front of every road, every forest defile, every river approach, through the winter of 1944 into 1945, the same mine, in fact, behind the field this piece opened with, a detail serious enough that it eventually surfaced decades later in that 1994 State Department landmine report. If the German mine industry was ever going to defeat the U.S. Army outright that autumn and winter, bad weather, dense forest, snow, and an entirely new generation of genuinely undetectable devices, was its best remaining opportunity. It didn't happen. What happened instead was that the American system, not any single piece of hardware, simply adapted again, reverting in places to the same slow, manual technique British sappers had used years earlier at El Alamein. Veteran accounts of that work in the Hürtgen Forest, the Vosges, and Lorraine are uniformly bleak. The 4th Infantry Division's own combat engineers in the Hürtgen, and the 12th Engineer Battalion specifically, which later received a Presidential Unit citation for that work, operated in conditions one British observer's 1944 dispatch described as something close to American indifference toward the physical needs of men fighting a genuine winter war. Cleared paths were marked with white engineer tape the wind promptly scattered and the snow just as promptly buried. A single disabled vehicle could halt an entire column behind it for hours. The Hürtgen Forest alone would eventually cost the U.S. Army something on the order of 33,000 casualties before it was finally taken. 3 things the German mine industry had never fully accounted for kept that line moving. The first was equipment that didn't depend on detection at all. By late 1944, Sherman tanks fitted with the T-1E3 mine exploder, nicknamed Aunt Jemima by the crews who operated them, were entering service in the European theater. 10 massive steel rollers, each roughly 8 feet across and nearly 3 inches thick, chain-driven off the tank's own drive sprocket, the combined weight of tank plus rollers running close to that of a Tiger One. Only around 100 of them were ever built, and they were slow, cumbersome, and limited to genuinely firm ground. Soft or muddy terrain could bog the extra weight down entirely, and the rollers themselves needed regular maintenance after absorbing repeated blasts, which meant Aunt Jemima units worked best paired with conventional infantry support rather than operating alone. But they physically rolled straight through minefields no shoe mine could ever detect, and no glass mine could meaningfully stop, on a principle that had nothing to do with sensing anything at all. 30 tons moving forward in a straight line will simply set off whatever lies beneath it, and the crew survives specifically because the rollers absorb the overwhelming majority of the blast before it ever reaches the hull. Mine plows and dozer blades did essentially the same job on a smaller scale, and the British 79th Armored Division's Sherman Crab flail tank, one of the celebrated Hobart's funnies, built around a rotating drum and heavy chains that literally beat the ground ahead of the vehicle, saw extensive use in multiple Allied operations from D-Day onward. Detection had simply stopped being the only available path through a minefield. Pushing the devices aside or detonating them outright with sheer mass worked just as well. The second factor was explosive solutions built for scale. The M1A1 Bangalore torpedo, standardized for U.S. Army use that February, remained the workhorse. American engineers used it extensively at Omaha Beach to blast gaps through German wire, again along the Siegfried Line, in the Hürtgen, and all along the final approaches to the Rhine. For larger jobs, there was the so-called snake, lengths of explosive-filled tubing pushed ahead of a tank and detonated to clear an entire wide lane at once. It saw limited but genuinely instructive success at Fort Bryant during the Lorraine campaign, and the improved line charges that grew directly out of that idea became standard equipment in essentially every modern army on Earth after the war ended. The third factor, and arguably the most decisive one, was a doctrine of pure industrial replacement. The Sherman tank was, by 1944, genuinely outclassed by both the Tiger and the Panther in almost every direct technical comparison. Thinner armor, a weaker gun, a silhouette German gunners learned to read at considerable range. It was also produced in numbers that made the comparison close to irrelevant. Roughly 50,000 Shermans rolled off American assembly lines by the war's end, against a total German production run of well under 2,000 Tigers across the entire conflict. When a Sherman lost its tracks to a Teller mine, it was repaired or simply replaced within days, often by the same crew climbing into a fresh vehicle waiting a few miles behind the line. When a Tiger hit an Allied mine, it was, for practical purposes, gone, and the trained crew and the specialized recovery equipment needed to salvage it were both increasingly scarce commodities Germany could no longer easily spare. That earlier statistic, mines accounting for just over 20% of all American tank losses, sounds close to catastrophic in isolation until you set it against a second number. American industry could replace those specific losses considerably faster than German industry could replace either the tanks or the trained engineers laying the mines that caused them. The clearest single-field example of what this whole system actually looked like in practice belongs to the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel David E. Pergrin. During the Battle of the Bulge that December, the 291st, lightly armed, never intended as a frontline combat unit at all, became the primary force that physically stopped Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance, not through firepower, but through a methodical campaign of blowing bridges directly in front of Peiper's own tanks. Pergrin, reading Peiper's likely routes off a map with what more than one account later described as a chess player's patience, positioned his companies at the specific bridges Peiper's column would need, and, on at least one documented occasion, waited until a lead German tank was already partway across a span before detonating it, Peiper himself reportedly erupting afterward in genuine fury, shouting, "Diese verdammten Pioniere!" those damned engineers. Elements of the 291st were also among the first American troops to discover survivors of the Malmedy massacre, and it was Pergrin himself who first reported the atrocity up the chain of command. By the end of the war, according to the battalion's own surviving records, the 291st had built 44 Bailey bridges, 23 timber bridges, and 7 treadway bridges, made 7 opposed river crossings, disarmed 15 unexploded bombs, cleared roughly 7,000 mines, and taken 8,500 German prisoners, while losing only 8 men killed in action across the entire war. 8. In March 1945, the same battalion, on the strength of that reputation, was selected to build an 1,100-foot treadway bridge across the Rhine at Remagen in just 32 hours, under continued enemy fire, opening the way for the final Allied drive into central Germany. If your father, grandfather, or anyone you loved served in an American engineer battalion, the 291st, the 531st, the 12th, or any of the roughly 700 that existed by the war's end, and ever told you anything about clearing mines, I'd genuinely be glad to read their story in the comments. These units received far fewer films and far fewer monuments than the infantry divisions they made possible, which has never really seemed like a fair balance. Underneath those three factors, though, sits the deepest reason the German mine ultimately failed, the one hardest to put on any balance sheet, and one that sounds, at first pass, close to a cliché, except that it genuinely isn't one. The American army accepted losses as the price of continuing to advance. The Wehrmacht, the same institution that had broken the French army in 6 weeks in 1940 and inflicted millions of casualties on the Soviet Union, built its entire mine industry around an assumption inherited directly from the First World War, that a sufficiently dense, sufficiently lethal field of explosives would eventually break the will of the men forced to walk through it. That assumption had genuinely worked in 1914 and 1918, and at several specific points against Soviet forces in 1942 and 1943. It simply didn't work against the Americans in 1944 and 1945, not because American troops were braver, not because they were better trained or better led in any simple sense, but because the U.S. Army, alone among the major combatants of that war, had organized itself from the bottom of its own field manuals to the very top of its production lines around one specific, unsentimental truth about modern combat, that losses are not the same thing as failure. I don't think that distinction gets stated plainly enough in most popular retellings of this war, honestly, because it doesn't flatter anyone involved and it resists being turned into a single dramatic scene. Fields like the one this piece opened with got cleared because the men assigned to them had simply been told to clear them, whatever it cost. Engineers prodded, lifted, detonated. Some were killed, some lost feet. The unit moved on, and by the time the after-action reports were filed, the field itself was already reduced to a footnote. The 4th Infantry Division at Utah Beach, the 1st at Omaha, engineers in the Hurtgen, the 291st blowing bridges in front of Piper's tanks. Every one of these units had absorbed in some form the same underlying instruction. Mines are an obstacle. Obstacles get reduced. You will take losses, and you will keep going anyway. That wasn't heroism in the way films usually stage it. It was something colder and in its own way more impressive. An institutional acceptance written directly into doctrine and reinforced at every level from squad leader up to Army Group Commander that the correct answer to a minefield was never to stop. The answer was to clear it, mark it, absorb whatever cost it demanded, and keep moving. The German mine had been engineered specifically to break that particular calculation. It never actually managed to. By the late winter of 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine, the millions of devices Rommel had ordered into the ground the year before were being methodically neutralized by engineer units, whose names mostly never made it into any popular history. The 1st Engineer Special Brigade, the 1,111th Engineer Group, the 738th Tank Battalion Special with its own fleet of Aunt Jemima Shermans. Jay Rencher made it home from the war. David Pergrin made it home and eventually wrote his own detailed account of the 291st's war. Most of the men who cleared the Lorraine minefields, the ground behind Utah Beach, and the forests of the Hurtgen never became remotely famous. They went back to being salesmen, farmers, mechanics, and teachers, and lived quietly with what they'd actually seen and done, some of them never once describing to anyone what it felt like to crawl forward on hands and knees in the snow, prodding the frozen ground ahead with a bayonet, fully aware the next few inches might be the last thing they ever felt. It was never really the mine that failed. It was the underlying assumption that any single weapon, however lethal, could stop an army that had organized itself completely from the bottom line of a field manual to the top of an entire production line around the specific problem of getting past it. Germany built, by almost every honest technical measure, the finest landmines fielded by any combatant in the Second World War. America built the actual answer to landmines, and that answer was never a better mine. It was a fundamentally better way of being an army.